There are places where dreams go to die, where laughter turns to screams, and where the ink runs black with secrets too dark to remember. Imagine walking through the abandoned halls of a once glorious animation studio, where the walls drip with memories and the shadows move with a life of their own. Picture a world where cartoon characters were never meant to be just drawings on paper, where something terrible happened behind closed doors, and where the line between creation and nightmare blurred beyond recognition. This is not just a story about a video game. This is the story of Joey Drew Studios, a place where ambition twisted into madness, where artists poured their souls into their work only to have those souls trapped forever, and where a little dancing demon named Bendy became the face of something far more sinister than anyone could have imagined. What you are about to hear will take you deep into the heart of a cartoon nightmare, through corridors filled with ink and terror, past the remnants of broken dreams and shattered lives, and into the very core of what happens when someone plays God with pencils and paper. This is the entire story of Bendy and the Ink Machine, a tale of horror wrapped in the disguise of innocent animation, a journey that begins with hope and ends in darkness, and a warning about what lurks beneath the surface of nostalgia and childhood wonder. Long before the ink turned black with horror and the studio became a tomb of nightmares, there was a time when Joey Drew Studios represented the pinnacle of animation magic and creative wonder. In the roaring 1930s, when the Great Depression cast shadows across America and people desperately needed escape and entertainment, animation studios rose like beacons of hope and joy. Among them stood Joey Drew Studios, a place that promised to bring laughter and happiness to millions through the magic of cartoons. Joey Drew himself was a dreamer, a visionary who saw the potential in animation long before most people understood what cartoons could become. He was a man with grand ambitions and even grander speeches, someone who could inspire artists and animators with his words and his vision of creating something truly special. Joey believed that cartoons were not just entertainment but art, not just drawings but living, breathing entities that could touch hearts and change lives. He gathered around him some of the most talented artists of his generation, people who shared his passion for animation and his belief that they were creating something that would last forever. The studio itself became a bustling center of creativity and innovation, with departments dedicated to every aspect of animation production. There was the music department where talented composers and musicians created catchy tunes that would stick in people's heads for days. There was the art department where skilled artists drew the characters frame by frame, bringing them to life through sheer talent and dedication. There was the voice acting booth where performers gave personality and charm to the cartoon creations. There was the ink department where the crucial work of preparing the ink for animation took place, a department that would later become the source of unspeakable horror. The studio employed dozens of people, each one contributing their unique skills to the collective dream of making the finest cartoons in America. Among these talented individuals was Henry Stein, one of the original animators who helped create the very first Bendy cartoons. Henry was a quiet man, dedicated to his craft, someone who poured his heart and soul into every drawing he made. He had a special connection to Bendy, having been there from the very beginning when the character was just a rough sketch on paper. Henry and Joey worked closely together in those early days, with Joey providing the vision and Henry bringing that vision to life through his exceptional drawing skills. Bendy the Dancing Demon was born from this collaboration, a character designed to compete with the popular cartoon mascots of other studios. With his wide smile, his white gloves, his bow tie, and his mischievous personality, Bendy was meant to be lovable and entertaining, a character that audiences would immediately embrace. The design was simple but effective, following the style of cartoon characters from that era with their rubber-hose limbs and exaggerated expressions. Bendy was accompanied by a cast of supporting characters including Boris the Wolf, a gentle and kind character who served as Bendy's best friend, and Alice Angel, a beautiful and talented performer who brought elegance and grace to the cartoons. Together these characters starred in numerous short films that played in theaters across the country, delighting audiences young and old. The Bendy cartoons featured simple stories filled with slapstick comedy, musical numbers, and the kind of innocent humor that defined animation in that golden age. Audiences loved the cartoons, and Joey Drew Studios found success and recognition, with their characters becoming household names and their films playing to packed theaters. Behind the scenes, however, things were not as perfect as they appeared on screen. Joey Drew was not just a dreamer and visionary, but also a demanding and sometimes ruthless businessman who pushed his employees to their limits. He expected perfection in every frame, dedication beyond reason, and loyalty that bordered on worship. Workers at the studio often put in long hours with little rest, driven by Joey's insistence that they were creating art that would define animation history. The pressure was intense, and not everyone could handle it. Some workers left the studio, unable to cope with the demanding environment, while others stayed out of loyalty to the craft or fear of losing their jobs during difficult economic times. Joey had a way of making people feel that they were part of something special, something bigger than themselves, and many workers sacrificed their personal lives and well-being for the sake of the studio. There were whispers even in those early days that Joey was obsessed with more than just making cartoons, that he had strange ideas about bringing his creations to life in ways that went beyond animation. Some workers dismissed these whispers as rumors or jokes, but others noticed that Joey spent a lot of time locked in his office, studying strange books and conducting mysterious experiments that had nothing to do with animation. The studio expanded rapidly during its peak years, adding new departments and hiring more staff to keep up with the demand for Bendy cartoons. They built a toy department to create merchandise featuring the characters, understanding early on the potential for licensing and product sales. They expanded the music department to create more elaborate scores for their cartoons, hiring talented musicians who composed beautiful and haunting melodies. They even built an entire floor dedicated to storage and archives, where they kept copies of all their work, along with equipment and supplies. The studio became a massive operation, a small empire built on ink and dreams. Joey Drew walked through the halls like a king surveying his kingdom, proud of what he had built and hungry for more success. He was never satisfied with what they had achieved, always pushing for bigger and better, always looking for new ways to make his studio stand out. He commissioned elaborate sets and props for reference, filled the studio with cutouts and statues of the characters, and created an environment where the line between the cartoon world and the real world became increasingly blurred. For those who worked there, the studio became their entire life, a place they spent more time than in their own homes, a place that demanded everything they had to give. Henry Stein eventually left the studio, unable to continue working under Joey's increasingly demanding and strange leadership. It was a difficult decision because Henry loved the characters he had helped create and felt a deep connection to Bendy and the world they had built. But the environment had become too intense, too consuming, and Henry needed to step away for his own well-being. He left on seemingly good terms with Joey, though there was an unspoken tension between them, a sense that Joey felt betrayed by Henry's departure. Joey believed that true artists never abandoned their creations, that dedication meant staying no matter what, and he could not understand why Henry would walk away from something so special. For his part, Henry felt that he needed to have a life outside the studio, to find balance and peace that seemed impossible while working for Joey Drew. He moved on to other work, but he never forgot Bendy and the characters he had helped bring to life, carrying with him memories of those early days when everything seemed possible and the future looked bright. Little did Henry know that his connection to the studio and to Bendy would call him back years later, pulling him into a nightmare beyond anything he could have imagined. As the years passed and the studio continued its operations, Joey Drew's behavior became increasingly erratic and his obsessions grew deeper and darker. The success of the Bendy cartoons was no longer enough for him. He wanted something more, something that would make him not just a successful animator but a creator in the truest sense of the word. Joey became fixated on the idea of bringing his cartoon creations to life, not through animation on screen but through some form of actual physical manifestation. He began studying subjects far removed from animation, delving into books about science, philosophy, and even darker topics that most people would consider superstition or madness. Joey's office became filled with strange texts and unusual artifacts, and he spent hours locked away, researching and planning something that his employees could not fully understand. Those who caught glimpses of his work saw drawings and diagrams that made no sense, formulas and symbols that had nothing to do with making cartoons. Some workers began to feel uncomfortable with the direction Joey was taking, sensing that something was very wrong. But speaking up against Joey Drew was dangerous for anyone who wanted to keep their job. The turning point came when Joey became aware of something called the ink machine, a device that was supposedly more than just equipment for animation production. According to Joey's research, this machine could do far more than produce ink for drawing. He believed it had the potential to create life itself, to transform drawings and imagination into physical reality. Whether Joey discovered information about such a machine or invented the concept himself remains unclear, but what is certain is that he became completely consumed by the idea. He began working with Thomas Connor, the studio's maintenance and engineering expert, to build what he called the ink machine. Thomas was a practical man, skilled with tools and machinery, someone who could build or fix almost anything. He was initially confused by Joey's requests, which seemed to go far beyond anything needed for animation production, but Joey assured him that this machine would revolutionize their work and secure the studio's future. Thomas had his doubts, but he followed Joey's instructions, constructing a massive machine that took up an enormous amount of space in the studio's lower levels. The ink machine was unlike anything the studio had ever seen before. It was a massive, complex apparatus with pipes and valves, chambers and reservoirs, a mechanical monster that seemed to pulse with its own strange energy once activated. Joey invested enormous amounts of the studio's money into this project, diverting funds from animation production to focus on his mysterious machine. This caused financial strain on the studio and created tension among the staff, who could see that resources were being wasted on something that had nothing to do with making cartoons. Deadlines were missed, quality began to suffer, and the studio's reputation started to decline. Workers who questioned Joey's priorities were fired or reassigned, creating an atmosphere of fear and uncertainty. Joey surrounded himself only with those who were completely loyal or too afraid to object, creating an inner circle that helped him pursue his obsession while keeping most of the staff in the dark about his true intentions. The studio that had once been a place of creativity and joy was transforming into something darker, a place where strange experiments took precedence over art, and where Joey's madness infected everything like poison. Thomas Connor became increasingly disturbed by what he was building and what Joey was doing with the ink machine. He wrote messages and warnings, leaving them hidden around the studio, trying to alert others to the danger without directly confronting Joey. Thomas knew that the machine was being used for purposes far beyond its apparent function, and he suspected that Joey's experiments were not only wrong but dangerous. He tried to sabotage the machine subtly, making small adjustments that he hoped would prevent it from working properly, but Joey always found ways to fix or bypass these issues. Thomas eventually realized that he was trapped, unable to stop what was happening, but also unable to simply walk away because Joey would never let him leave knowing what he knew. Other workers also became aware that something terrible was happening in the lower levels of the studio, in areas that were suddenly off-limits to most staff. Strange noises echoed through the pipes, mechanical groans and sounds that seemed almost organic. The smell of ink became overwhelming in certain areas, a thick, acrid smell that made people feel sick. Some workers reported seeing strange things moving in the shadows, though these reports were dismissed as imagination or stress-induced hallucinations. Joey Drew's vision for the ink machine involved using it to create living versions of the cartoon characters, with Bendy being the primary focus of his experiments. He believed that if he could bring Bendy to life, he would achieve something that no one else in history had ever accomplished. He would be more than an animator or businessman. He would be a creator of life, someone who bridged the gap between imagination and reality. Joey's journals and recordings from this period reveal a man who had completely lost touch with normal thinking, someone who believed he was on the verge of a breakthrough that would change everything. He spoke about his creations as if they were his children, as if he had a right and responsibility to bring them into existence. He studied everything he could find about life, consciousness, and the soul, trying to understand what made something truly alive rather than just animated. His research led him down increasingly dark paths, into areas of knowledge that most people avoided for good reason. Joey became convinced that creating life required more than just machinery and ink, that it required something deeper, something spiritual or supernatural. This belief led Joey to explore areas that would have shocked and horrified his employees if they had known the full extent of his actions. He began incorporating strange rituals and symbols into his experiments, drawing designs on the walls and floors of the studio, particularly in the areas around the ink machine. These symbols came from sources that had nothing to do with animation or art, sources that dealt with dark practices and forbidden knowledge. Joey believed that combining science, art, and these darker elements would give him the power to create genuine life. He set up shrines and special rooms where he conducted ceremonies that were equal parts experiment and ritual, using the ink from the machine as a key component. The ink itself seemed to take on unusual properties under Joey's treatment, becoming thick and almost alive, moving in ways that regular ink should not move. Workers who encountered this ink reported that it felt wrong, that touching it left them feeling sick and disturbed. Some developed health problems after exposure to the ink, suffering from strange symptoms that doctors could not explain. The studio was becoming toxic in both a literal and figurative sense, poisoned by Joey's obsession and the unnatural experiments he was conducting. The ink machine eventually produced results, though not the results that Joey had hoped for or expected. Instead of creating perfect living versions of the cartoon characters, the machine produced something far more disturbing and horrifying. The first creation to emerge from the ink machine was a twisted mockery of Bendy, a creature that had some of the character's features but was warped and wrong in every way. This creature became known as Bendy the Ink Demon, and it was nothing like the cheerful dancing demon from the cartoons. It was a monster made of ink, with a body that seemed to constantly drip and reform, with a smile that was too wide and menacing, with empty eyes that held no warmth or joy. The ink demon was alive in some horrible way, capable of movement and what seemed like thought, but it was not a being that should exist. It was a nightmare-given form, a corruption of everything the cartoon character was supposed to represent. Joey's reaction to this creation was complex. Part of him was horrified by what he had made, recognizing that this was not what he intended, but another part of him was fascinated and excited because he had actually created something living, even if it was monstrous. Joey did not stop with this first failed attempt. Instead, he became more determined, believing that with more experiments and refinements, he could eventually create the perfect Bendy. He continued to use the ink machine, producing more creatures and abominations, each one a different kind of failure. Some of these creations were incomplete, formed only partially before collapsing back into puddles of ink. Others were more stable but equally twisted, beings that existed in constant agony, aware enough to suffer but not capable of communication or reason. The studio's lower levels became a gallery of horrors, filled with these failed experiments that were kept hidden from most of the staff. Joey built containment areas and special chambers to keep the creations controlled, but these measures were not always effective. The ink demon in particular proved difficult to contain, showing an ability to move through the ink pipes and emerge in different areas of the studio. It seemed to have some form of intelligence, learning and adapting, becoming more dangerous over time. Workers who encountered the ink demon rarely survived the experience, and those who did were left traumatized, often leaving the studio immediately and never speaking about what they had seen. The creation of other characters followed similar patterns of failure and horror. Joey attempted to create a living version of Boris the wolf, hoping that perhaps a different character would yield better results. The Boris creatures that emerged from the ink machine were tragic beings, more successful than the Bendy creations in terms of stability but still fundamentally wrong. Some of these Boris creatures retained more of the gentle nature of the original character, but they were trapped in bodies that were not truly alive, existing in a state between life and death. Joey treated these creations with varying degrees of care or cruelty depending on his mood and their usefulness to his experiments. Some he kept as test subjects, continuing to study them and trying to understand why his creations were not perfect. Others he simply discarded, allowing them to roam the studio or disposing of them when they became problematic. The tragedy of these creatures was that they had some level of awareness, understanding on some level that they were wrong, that they should not exist, but they were powerless to change their condition or end their suffering. The attempts to create Alice Angel produced perhaps the most disturbing results of all. Alice was meant to be beautiful and perfect, the angel of the cartoon world, and Joey was determined that her living version would capture that beauty. However, the Alice creatures that emerged were anything but angelic. They were obsessed with perfection and beauty, driven mad by the knowledge that they were flawed and incomplete. One Alice in particular, a creation that retained more consciousness and personality than the others, became fixated on making herself perfect through any means necessary. She set up her own domain in the studio, collecting resources and conducting her own twisted experiments. This Alice creature understood that she was not the real Alice Angel, that she was just a copy made from ink, and this knowledge tormented her endlessly. She sought to improve herself by taking parts from other creatures, by using the ink in new ways, by anything that might make her more complete. Her vanity and desperation made her incredibly dangerous, as she would do anything to anyone if she believed it would bring her closer to the perfection she craved. The studio staff became aware that something was terribly wrong, even if they did not know the full details of what Joey was doing. People started disappearing, workers who went into restricted areas and never came out, employees who asked too many questions and were never seen again. Some workers quit out of fear, but Joey made it difficult for people to leave, using threats and manipulation to keep his secrets contained. The studio became a prison for many of its employees, people who wanted to escape but felt they had no choice but to stay. The atmosphere was one of constant dread and paranoia, with everyone knowing that something horrible was happening, but no one willing to speak openly about it. Joey maintained a facade of normalcy in the public-facing areas of the studio, continuing to produce cartoons and maintain business operations, but behind closed doors, he was running a nightmare factory. The ink from the machine began to spread throughout the studio, seeping through the pipes and into the walls, staining everything it touched. The building itself seemed to become corrupted by the ink, with reality becoming unstable in certain areas where the ink pooled and concentrated. Sammy Lawrence, the music director, was among those who became deeply affected by the ink and Joey's experiments. Sammy was a brilliant musician who had composed most of the memorable tunes from the Bendy cartoons, a man who lived for his music and took great pride in his work. However, prolonged exposure to the ink and the influence of the ink demon drove Sammy into madness. He became obsessed with the ink demon, seeing it not as a monster but as a dark god worthy of worship. Sammy created a cult within the studio, gathering followers who were similarly affected by the ink, and they began conducting ceremonies and rituals dedicated to the ink demon. Sammy believed that if he served the ink demon faithfully, he would be rewarded, perhaps transformed into something better or granted some form of salvation. His music became twisted and dark, compositions that reflected his deteriorating mental state and his devotion to the creature. Sammy wore a mask made from a Bendy cutout, losing his own identity and becoming wholly devoted to serving his dark lord. The cult he created added another layer of danger to the studio, as these incorrupted individuals would attack anyone they perceived as a threat or as a potential sacrifice to the ink demon. As Joey Drew's experiments continued and the horrors multiplied, the studio entered its final phase of operation, a period of chaos and disintegration. The business side of the studio collapsed as Joey diverted all resources to his increasingly desperate attempts to perfect his creations. Cartoon production essentially stopped, with the last Bendy cartoons being released years before the studio's final closure. Without new products to sell, the studio's income dried up and debts accumulated. Suppliers stopped delivering materials, distributors severed their contracts, and what few clients remained lost interest. Joey seemed unconcerned with these practical matters, focused entirely on his work with the ink machine, convinced that once he succeeded in creating the perfect Bendy, all other problems would be solved. He believed that a living cartoon character would be such a sensation that success and wealth would naturally follow, that he would be hailed as a genius and vindicated for all his efforts. This delusion kept him going even as everything fell apart around him, even as the studio became more of a tomb than a workplace. The remaining employees found themselves trapped in a building that was falling apart both structurally and morally. The ink had corroded pipes and weakened walls, creating dangerous conditions throughout the studio. Areas flooded with ink became impassable, forcing workers to navigate through increasingly limited spaces. The electrical systems became unreliable, leaving many areas in darkness. The ventilation failed in some sections, making the air thick with the smell of ink and creating breathing problems. Food and supplies became scarce as deliveries stopped, and workers had to ration what little remained. Some employees attempted to escape, but the studio had become a labyrinth, with Joey having sealed or blocked many exits to prevent people from leaving with knowledge of his secrets. Those who tried to find their way out often became lost in the maze of corridors and rooms, eventually falling victim to the ink demon or the other creatures that roamed the halls. The studio had transformed into a death trap, a place where the walls themselves seemed hostile and where danger lurked around every corner. Wally Franks, the janitor, was one of the few employees who managed to escape before the final collapse. Wally was a simple man who just wanted to do his job and go home, but he found himself in an increasingly impossible situation as the studio deteriorated. He left messages and recordings complaining about the working conditions, about having to clean up ink constantly, about strange things happening that no one would explain. Wally recognized that staying would mean death or worse, and he found a way out, leaving behind his tools and equipment in his desperate flight. His escape was one of the last times anyone left the studio alive. Other employees were not so fortunate. Grant Cohen, the accountant, remained trapped, driven to despair by the financial ruin and the impossible situation he found himself in. Grant tried to maintain the books and make sense of the studio's finances, but it was a hopeless task. His recordings reveal a man slowly losing his grip on reality, unable to cope with the disaster unfolding around him. Grant eventually succumbed to the ink, becoming another victim of Joey's madness. Susie Campbell, the original voice actress for Alice Angel, met a particularly tragic fate. Susie loved her role and felt a deep connection to Alice, believing that she was the true voice of the angel and that she and the character were inseparable. However, Joey replaced her with another actress named Allison Pendle, a decision that devastated Susie and filled her with rage and jealousy. Susie could not accept being replaced, could not bear the thought of someone else voicing her character. In her desperation to reclaim her role and prove that she was the true Alice, Susie allowed Joey to use her in his experiments. She believed that if she became Alice Angel, truly became the character in physical form, she would achieve the perfection and recognition she deserved. Instead, the transformation through the ink machine created one of the most twisted Alice creatures, a being that retained Susie's consciousness and memories, but trapped in a body that was a mockery of the beauty she sought. This Alice became obsessed with perfection, with making herself whole, with punishing anyone she perceived as a threat to her claim as the true Alice Angel. Her domain in the studio became a place of particular horror, where she conducted cruel experiments and collected what she needed to improve herself, all while slowly losing whatever remained of Susie Campbell's humanity. The final days of the studio were apocalyptic in nature, with Joey making increasingly desperate attempts to achieve his goal. He pushed the ink machine to its limits, conducting ritual after ritual, experiment after experiment, combining science and dark practices in ways that defied all reason and morality. The machine itself began to malfunction, producing ink at rates that flooded entire floors of the studio. The ink took on a life of its own, responding to Joey's will to some degree but also acting according to its own dark nature. It consumed everything it touched, transforming the studio into an environment that was more ink than physical matter. Workers who came into contact with the ink found themselves being absorbed by it, their bodies breaking down and reforming into creatures or simply becoming part of the ink itself. The boundary between the physical world and some nightmare dimension seemed to blur, with reality becoming unstable within the studio walls. Time itself appeared to function differently in certain areas, with some rooms existing in states that defied logic or natural law. Joey Drew's final fate remains somewhat mysterious, though it is clear that his experiments ultimately consumed him as they had consumed everything else. Whether he succeeded in some twisted way or failed completely is open to interpretation. What is known is that the studio was eventually abandoned, sealed off from the outside world, left to rot with all its horrors trapped inside. The building became a forbidden place, avoided by everyone who knew anything about it, standing empty for decades. Joey Drew himself disappeared from public record, with no clear information about his death or what became of him. Some believe he died in the studio, another victim of his own creation. Others think he escaped and lived out his remaining years in hiding, haunted by what he had done. There are even darker theories suggesting that Joey became part of the ink world he created, transformed into something neither alive nor dead, forever trapped in the nightmare he had built. Whatever the truth, Joey Drew Studios closed its doors for the last time, leaving behind a legacy of horror and a building filled with unspeakable things that should never have been created. 30 years passed in the outside world, 3 decades during which the abandoned Joey Drew Studios stood silent and forgotten, its doors locked and its windows dark. Henry Stein had moved on with his life, building a career elsewhere, creating new art, and trying to forget about the strange days at Joey Drew Studios. He had heard that the studio had closed, but he did not know the details or the horrors that had transpired after his departure. Henry had made peace with his past, accepting that his time creating Bendy was over and that he needed to focus on the present and future. He thought about the old days sometimes, remembering the excitement of creating something new and the joy of seeing audiences respond to the cartoons. But these were distant memories that no longer had power over his daily life. Then one day, Henry received a letter that would change everything. The letter was from Joey Drew, written in Joey's distinctive handwriting, asking Henry to return to the old studio for a visit. The tone of the letter was friendly and nostalgic, with Joey writing about old times and expressing a desire to show Henry something special. Henry was surprised to receive the letter, having had no contact with Joey for decades. Part of him was curious about what Joey wanted to show him, perhaps nostalgic for the old days despite everything. Another part of him was hesitant, remembering the strange atmosphere that had developed before he left and the uncomfortable feeling he had about Joey's direction. However, the letter seemed innocent enough, just an old colleague reaching out after many years, and Henry decided to accept the invitation. He made the journey to the old studio building, finding it exactly as he remembered it from the outside, though clearly abandoned and neglected. The front door was unlocked, which struck Henry as odd, but he assumed Joey had arranged access for his visit. Henry entered the building, calling out for Joey but receiving no answer. The studio was dark and silent, filled with dust and shadows, a far cry from the bustling workplace Henry remembered. As he explored the front areas, Henry found himself overwhelmed with memories, seeing old artwork on the walls, finding familiar objects and equipment, walking through spaces where he had spent so many hours creating cartoons. As Henry ventured deeper into the studio, he began to notice that things were very wrong. The building was not just abandoned but seemed to be in a state of impossible decay and corruption. Ink dripped from the ceilings and pooled on the floors, far more ink than should be present in any normal building. The walls were stained and marked with strange symbols and messages written by former employees, warnings and cries for help from people who had suffered terrible fates. Equipment was broken and twisted, looking like it had been torn apart or melted. The deeper Henry went, the more disturbing the environment became, until he realized that this was not just an old building but something far more sinister. He tried to turn back and leave, but he discovered that the path behind him had changed, that the studio itself seemed to be rearranging its layout to trap him inside. Henry found himself forced to descend deeper into the studio, following a path that seemed predetermined, as if something was guiding him toward a specific destination. Henry encountered the ink machine for the first time, a massive device that dominated an entire chamber deep in the studio's lower levels. The machine was still functioning somehow, pumping and churning, producing the ink that flooded throughout the building. Henry was shocked and confused, unable to understand what this machine was or why Joey had built it. As he searched for answers and a way out, Henry began finding audio logs and messages left by former employees, recordings that told the story of what had happened at the studio after he left. Through these recordings, Henry learned about Joey's obsession with creating life, about the experiments and the creatures, about the suffering and death that had filled the studio's final days. Each discovery was more horrifying than the last, painting a picture of madness and evil that Henry could barely comprehend. He learned about Thomas Connor's warnings, about Sammy Lawrence's descent into madness, about Susie Campbell's tragic transformation, about all the people who had died or worse because of Joey's ambitions. The true horror began when Henry encountered the creatures that still inhabited the studio. The first was a Boris the wolf creature, one that seemed more stable and friendly than the others, one that Henry desperately wanted to believe was harmless despite its unsettling appearance. Then came the searchers, ink creatures that shambled through the halls, beings that had once been human workers, but were now reduced to mindless monsters made entirely of ink. These searchers attacked Henry on sight, forcing him to defend himself and flee. Henry also encountered the Butcher Gang, twisted versions of minor characters from the cartoons, creatures that had been transformed into violent and aggressive monsters. Each encounter reinforced the nightmare reality that Henry found himself trapped in, a world where the cartoons he had helped create had become instruments of horror. The studio itself seemed alive and malicious, with rooms changing layouts, doors appearing and disappearing, and pathways forming and collapsing. Henry realized that he was not just trapped in a building but trapped in some kind of uncreated dimension, a nightmare world that operated according to rules that defied normal reality. Henry's exploration eventually brought him face to face with the Ink Demon, the twisted bendy creature that stalked the halls. The first encounter was terrifying, with Henry catching only a glimpse of the monster before having to hide and escape. The Ink Demon was massive and threatening, moving through the ink with ease, appearing and disappearing in ways that made it seem almost supernatural. Its smile was a mockery of the cheerful Bendy from the cartoons, stretched too wide and filled with menace. Its entire form dripped and reformed constantly, never quite solid, always shifting and changing. The worst part was its unpredictability, the way it could appear anywhere at any time, the way it seemed to be hunting Henry specifically. Every moment Henry spent in the studio was filled with the fear that the Ink Demon would appear, that he would be caught and killed or transformed into another one of the twisted creatures that populated this nightmare world. The Ink Demon became a constant presence in Henry's journey, appearing at key moments to pursue him, forcing Henry to run and hide, creating tension and terror that never let up. Henry's navigation through the twisted studio brought him into contact with Sammy Lawrence, the former music director who had become the prophet of the Ink Demon's cult. Sammy was no longer human in any meaningful sense, having been so thoroughly corrupted by the ink that his body had transformed into a creature made entirely of that substance. He wore a bendy mask, having completely surrendered his own identity to serve the Ink Demon, believing himself to be the prophet and servant of a dark god. Sammy had claimed an entire section of the studio as his domain, turning it into a place of worship where he and his followers conducted rituals and prepared sacrifices. The walls were covered with messages written in ink, declarations of faith and devotion to the Ink Demon, warnings to those who would not submit, and ravings that revealed Sammy's completely shattered mind. Sammy had set up altars and ceremonial spaces, using props and equipment from the studio's toy and art departments to create his places of worship, transforming items that were once innocent into symbols of dark devotion. When Henry encountered Sammy, the former music director initially seemed to view Henry as just another intruder or potential sacrifice. Sammy's speech was religious in nature, filled with references to his Lord and the salvation that would come through submission to the Ink Demon. He spoke in a way that suggested he believed the Ink Demon was not just a creature but a powerful entity worthy of worship, something that could grant rewards to faithful servants. Sammy had convinced others to follow him, creating a group of believers who served as his assistants in conducting rituals. These cultists were themselves corrupted by the ink, no longer fully human, existing in a state between life and death, animated by belief in the Ink Demon and fear of what would happen if they disobeyed. Sammy used music as part of his rituals, playing twisted versions of the old Bendy cartoon songs on instruments that were damaged and out of tune, creating sounds that were disturbing and wrong. The music that had once brought joy and entertainment had been corrupted into something that served darkness, a symbol of how everything in the studio had been twisted from its original purpose. Sammy's plan for Henry was to use him as a sacrifice to the Ink Demon, believing that offering Henry to his lord would earn favor and perhaps reward. Sammy captured Henry and prepared him for sacrifice, conducting a ceremony that involved chanting and ritual actions designed to summon the Ink Demon. Sammy believed that the Ink Demon would be pleased with this offering, particularly because Henry was one of Bendy's original creators, someone whose sacrifice would have special meaning. During the ceremony, Sammy's devotion and insanity were on full display, his voice rising in fervor as he called for his lord to appear and accept the offering. However, when the Ink Demon did appear, it did not distinguish between sacrifice and servant. The creature attacked Sammy himself, killing or consuming him without any recognition of Sammy's loyalty or service. This moment was both terrifying and tragically ironic, as Sammy's faith in the Ink Demon was repaid with destruction. The creature he had worshipped and served showed no appreciation or mercy, treating Sammy as it would treat any other victim, revealing that the ink demon was not a god, but simply a monster without loyalty or conscience. Henry managed to escape during the chaos, fleeing while the ink demon dealt with Sammy. This encounter taught Henry several important things about the world he was trapped in. First, it confirmed that the ink demon was the most dangerous thing in the studio, a creature that could not be reasoned with or worshipped, only avoided or fought. Second, it showed that the corruption of the ink had driven multiple people to madness, creating dangers throughout the studio beyond just the ink demon itself. Third, it demonstrated that Joey's experiments had created a world where former employees were trapped in various forms, some as mindless creatures, others retaining consciousness but twisted into something horrible. Henry realized that everyone who had remained in the studio during its final days had suffered terrible fates, transformed or killed, with none escaping the consequences of Joey's madness. This knowledge weighed heavily on Henry, filling him with guilt and sadness even though he knew there was nothing he could have done to prevent it since he had left long before the worst events occurred. Exploring the areas that Sammy had controlled, Henry found more evidence of how the music director had changed and what the cult had been doing. There were rooms filled with candles and offerings, spaces where rituals had been conducted, and walls covered with sheet music that had been modified to include the cult's messages. Henry also found Sammy's personal audio logs, recordings made before Sammy had fully transformed, messages that tracked his descent from talented musician to incorrupted cultist. In these recordings, Sammy spoke about hearing the ink demon's voice, about feeling the call to serve, about his initial resistance and eventual surrender to the corruption. The progression was disturbing to hear, like listening to someone slowly lose their mind and humanity, unable to fight against the influence of the ink and the presence of the creature. Sammy's transformation was not sudden but gradual, a process that stripped away everything he had been until only the devotion to the ink demon remained. These recordings gave Henry insight into how the ink affected people, how it corrupted not just bodies but minds and souls, turning victims into servants of darkness. The cult's presence throughout the studio added another layer of danger to Henry's journey. Even though Sammy was gone, other cultists remained, still driven by their corrupted beliefs, still dangerous to anyone they encountered. These followers would attack Henry or try to capture him, believing that they were serving their purpose by eliminating or sacrificing intruders. The cult had created supply caches and pathways throughout the studio, leaving behind resources that Henry could use but also traps and dangers. The influence of the cult had spread into multiple areas, with their symbols and messages marking territory and warning of their presence. Henry had to be constantly vigilant, never knowing when he might encounter another cultist or stumble into an area where the cult had set up defenses. The religious aspect of the cult was particularly disturbing because it showed how the horrors of the studio had created a twisted belief system, how suffering and madness had combined to produce worship of the very thing that was causing the suffering. This perversion of faith and devotion was yet another crime to lay at Joey Drew's feet, another way in which his ambitions had destroyed lives and corrupted souls. As Henry continued deeper into the studio, he entered areas that had been claimed by one of the Alice Angel creatures, the one that had once been Susie Campbell. This section of the studio was different from others, showing signs of someone who had established control and organization rather than just chaos. Alice had created her own domain, a place where she conducted experiments and gathered resources, where she maintained a twisted version of order. The environment reflected Alice's obsession with perfection and beauty, with areas that she had tried to make beautiful despite the ink and decay that filled the studio. There were rooms decorated with stolen items and salvaged materials, attempts to create spaces that matched the elegance that Alice believed she should possess. However, these attempts at beauty were corrupted by the nature of her existence, with everything stained by ink and tainted by the horror of what she had become. Henry first encountered Alice through her voice over the studio speaker system, a voice that was beautiful and terrifying at the same time. Alice spoke to Henry with a mixture of charm and menace, presenting herself as someone who could help him, but also making it clear that she was in control and that Henry was in her territory. Her speech revealed her fractured mind, switching between seeming helpful and threatening, between rational thought and insane rambling. Alice was aware of who she was and what she had become in a way that many other creatures were not, and this awareness was a source of constant torment for her. She knew she was not the real Alice Angel but a failed copy made from ink, and this knowledge drove her to obsess over making herself perfect, over transforming herself into what she believed she should be. She spoke about the real Alice Angel from the cartoons with both longing and jealousy, wanting to be that character while also hating her for being the perfect original that she could never truly become. Alice forced Henry to complete tasks for her, using his presence as an opportunity to gather resources she needed for her experiments. She demanded that Henry collect certain items from dangerous areas of the studio, things she wanted but could not or would not retrieve herself. Henry had no choice but to comply if he wanted to progress and potentially escape, so he became Alice's servant temporarily, completing her requests while trying to find a way to get past her domain. The tasks Alice assigned were dangerous and disturbing, often involving venturing into areas filled with enemies or solving puzzles that required Henry to manipulate the ink or the machinery in specific ways. Through these tasks, Henry learned more about the studio's layout and history, finding more audio logs and evidence of what had happened. He also learned more about Alice herself, understanding through her demands and comments what drove her and what she hoped to achieve. Alice's experiments were focused on improving herself, on making herself more complete and perfect. She had been gathering parts from other creatures, particularly Boris creatures, using these parts in attempts to enhance her own form. Her domain contained operating rooms and workspaces where she conducted these experiments, areas that looked like nightmare versions of medical facilities. The walls were stained with ink, tables held tools and equipment that had been used for terrible purposes, and containers held parts and materials that Alice had collected. The most disturbing aspect was that Alice's experiments involved creatures that were still alive or at least aware, beings that suffered through her procedures as she tried to take what she needed from them. Alice showed no remorse for this suffering, viewing other creatures as resources to be used rather than beings deserving of compassion. Her obsession with perfection had made her cruel and ruthless, willing to do anything to anyone if it served her goals. Henry eventually completed the tasks Alice assigned, gathering everything she had demanded. However, when he returned to her, Alice's mood had shifted. She was no longer interested in helping Henry escape or even in continuing to use him for tasks. Instead, she became hostile, deciding that Henry himself could be useful as materials for her experiments. She attacked Henry or sent her servants to capture him, revealing that her apparent cooperation had been temporary and that she had never truly intended to let him leave her domain safely. Henry was forced to flee through Alice's territory, pursued by her and the creatures she commanded, fighting to survive and find a way out. During this escape, Henry witnessed more of Alice's cruelty and madness, seeing the results of her experiments and the suffering she had caused. He encountered cages holding creatures that Alice had captured, saw rooms where failed experiments had been discarded, and navigated through spaces that reflected Alice's deteriorating mental state. The confrontation with Alice revealed important aspects of the studio's corruption. Like Sammy, Alice retained more of her original personality and consciousness than many other creatures. But this retention came with the curse of awareness and understanding of what she had become. Unlike Sammy, who had found purpose in worshipping the ink demon, Alice was tormented by her existence, desperate to change it, but unable to achieve the transformation she sought. Her tragedy was that she could never be satisfied or complete, that no amount of experimentation or modification would make her into the perfect being she wanted to be. She was trapped in a cycle of failed attempts and growing desperation, becoming more corrupted and cruel with each failure. Henry's encounters with Alice showed him that the studio's horrors affected different people in different ways, that the ink and Joey's experiments created various forms of suffering and madness rather than just one kind of monster. Some creatures became mindless attackers, others became worshippers of the ink demon, and still others like Alice became obsessed pursuers of impossible goals. Throughout his journey, Henry had encountered a Boris creature that seemed different from the others, one that appeared friendly and helpful rather than hostile. This Boris did not attack Henry but instead seemed to want to assist him, showing behaviors that suggested intelligence and kindness similar to the original Boris character from the cartoons. Henry, desperate for any ally in this nightmare world, chose to trust this Boris, allowing the creature to accompany him through parts of the studio. Boris helped Henry solve puzzles, navigate dangerous areas, and even protected him from other creatures on several occasions. For Henry, having Boris as a companion provided not just practical help but also emotional comfort, a reminder that not everything in the studio was hostile and evil. Boris seemed to recognize Henry as someone who had created him, showing loyalty and affection that Henry found touching despite the strange circumstances. This relationship gave Henry hope that perhaps not all of Joey's creations were doomed to be monsters, that perhaps some good could exist even in this corrupted world. However, this hope was tragically destroyed when Alice captured Boris. Having completed her observations of Henry and Boris working together, Alice decided that this particular Boris was exactly what she needed for her experiments. She set a trap that separated Boris from Henry, capturing the gentle creature before Henry could intervene. Henry tried desperately to rescue Boris, but Alice's control over her domain was too complete, and she managed to take Boris away despite Henry's efforts. Alice taunted Henry with her intentions, making it clear that she planned to use Boris for parts, that his gentle nature and stability made him valuable as materials for her attempts at self-improvement. Henry was devastated by this loss, feeling guilt and responsibility for what was happening to Boris, wishing he had been more careful or found a way to protect his companion. The capture of Boris was not just a loss but a betrayal of the trust that had developed between them, a reminder that in the studio's nightmare world, even moments of kindness and friendship could be corrupted and destroyed. Alice proceeded with her plans for Boris, conducting experiments and modifications that transformed the gentle creature into something else entirely. What emerged from Alice's workshop was no longer the helpful companion that Henry had known but a twisted version called Brute Boris, a large and aggressive creature that had been fundamentally changed by Alice's procedures. Brute Boris was bigger and stronger than before, modified to be a weapon or enforcer rather than a friend. The worst part was that the original Boris's consciousness might still be trapped inside this modified form, aware of what he had become but unable to control his actions or return to what he had been. When Henry encountered Brute Boris, the creature attacked him, showing no recognition of their previous friendship. Henry was forced to fight or flee from what had been his companion, a heartbreaking situation that reinforced the cruelty of the studio's corrupted world. The transformation of Boris into Brute Boris represented another of Joey Drew's crimes, another way in which something good and innocent had been destroyed by the madness that filled the studio. The betrayal and loss of Boris affected Henry deeply, adding emotional weight to his physical journey through the studio. Henry had already been dealing with the shock and horror of discovering what had happened to Joey Drew Studios, learning about the suffering of former colleagues, and being hunted by monsters that wore the faces of characters he had created. Losing Boris added personal grief to this list, making the experience not just terrifying but emotionally painful. Henry blamed himself for trusting too easily, for not being more careful, for failing to protect someone who had helped him. He also blamed Joey Drew even more intensely, understanding that everything that happened to Boris, to Alice, to Sammy, and to everyone else was ultimately Joey's responsibility. Joey's ambition and madness had created this world where nothing good could survive untainted, where every moment of kindness was eventually crushed by horror and corruption. Henry's anger at Joey grew with each new discovery, each new encounter with the results of Joey's experiments, fueling his determination to survive and escape so that someone would know what had happened and what kind of monster Joey Drew had truly been. The encounter with Brute Boris also taught Henry about the nature of the ink creatures and the ink machine's creations. He learned that these beings could be modified and changed, that they were not fixed in their forms but could be transformed through additional procedures and experiments. This meant that the horrors could potentially be endless, that new variations and modifications could continue to be created as long as the ink machine functioned and someone was willing to conduct experiments. It also meant that death might not be final in this world, that creatures destroyed might be reformed, that consciousness trapped in the ink might be pulled out and placed into new bodies or combined with other beings. The implications were truly nightmarish, suggesting a form of immortality that was worse than death, an existence where suffering could continue indefinitely without release. Henry realized that escape from the studio was not just necessary for his survival but also a mercy compared to the fate of remaining trapped in this ink-created hell forever. As Henry descended deeper into the studio, he entered areas that had been built far below the original structure, levels that should not exist based on the building's external appearance. These depths were where Joey had conducted his most extreme experiments, where the ink machine's influence was strongest, and where reality itself became questionable. The environment in these areas was completely dominated by ink, with walls, floors, and ceilings all stained black, with pools and rivers of ink flowing through rooms and corridors. The machinery was more extensive and complex here, with massive pipes and valves, huge reservoirs and pumping stations, and equipment that seemed to serve purposes Henry could not understand. The architecture defied logic, with spaces that were too large to fit within the building's footprint, with stairways that seemed to go down forever, with rooms that existed in impossible configurations. Henry began to question whether he was still in the physical world or if he had crossed into some kind of dimension created entirely from ink and madness. In these depths, Henry found evidence of Joey's most desperate experiments and final attempts to achieve his goal. There were laboratories filled with equipment, ritual spaces covered with symbols and markings, and chambers where the ink machine's power was most concentrated. Henry found Joey's personal journals and audio logs from the final days, recordings where Joey's voice revealed his complete mental collapse and his absolute devotion to his work regardless of consequences. In these recordings, Joey spoke about success being close, about having discovered the secrets to creating perfect life, about being on the verge of becoming something more than human. He also spoke about sacrifices being necessary, about having given everything including his humanity to achieve his dreams, about having no regrets even though his actions had destroyed so many lives. Joey's final messages were those of a madman who had completely lost touch with morality and reality, someone who could not see or admit the evil he had committed, someone who believed to the end that he was creating something wonderful rather than something horrific. The depths also contained the most dangerous concentrations of creatures and corrupted beings. The searchers were everywhere in these areas, emerging from pools of ink in large numbers, making passage extremely difficult and dangerous. The ink demon's presence was strongest here, with the creature appearing more frequently and being more aggressive in its pursuit of Henry. The environmental hazards were also more extreme, with collapsing floors, flooding corridors, mechanical traps, and areas where the ink itself seemed to attack anyone passing through. Henry had to use all his resourcefulness and skills to navigate these depths, solving complex puzzles that required manipulating the machinery, finding alternate paths when direct routes were blocked, and timing his movements to avoid the ink demon's patrols. Each step forward was earned through effort and danger, with no guarantee that progress was even possible or that escape existed at the end of this nightmare journey. In the deepest areas, Henry discovered the source of the studio's corruption and the heart of the ink machine's power. He found a massive chamber where the machine's core was located, a place where Joey had conducted his final and most powerful rituals. The chamber was filled with ink to an impossible degree, with the substance seeming to have its own life and consciousness, responding to Henry's presence and trying to prevent him from interfering with the machinery. The symbols and markings on the walls glowed with strange energy, suggesting that Joey's experiments had indeed tapped into something beyond normal science, something that perhaps should never have been touched. Henry understood that to have any hope of escaping, he would need to confront the source of the horror directly, to face whatever waited in this chamber, and find a way to break free from the nightmare that had consumed the studio. The knowledge was terrifying because Henry knew that confronting the ink machine and whatever power it contained might result in his death or worse, his transformation into another creature trapped forever in this place. Henry also discovered that he was not the first version of himself to navigate the studio. He found evidence suggesting that Joey or the ink machine had pulled him into this nightmare multiple times, that each attempt to escape had failed, and that Henry had been reset and sent back to the beginning over and over again. This revelation was perhaps the most horrifying of all, suggesting that Henry had been trapped in a cycle of death and rebirth, that his struggles and suffering had been repeated countless times, and that escape might be impossible because the studio itself was designed to trap him forever. The evidence came from messages Henry found written in his own handwriting, warnings from previous versions of himself, items he had apparently placed in specific locations during earlier attempts. The implications suggested that the studio existed outside normal time, that it was a prison designed specifically for Henry as punishment or as part of some plan that Joey had created. Henry's determination grew despite this revelation, refusing to accept that he was doomed to repeat this nightmare forever, choosing to fight against the cycle even if success seemed impossible. Through collected journals, audio logs, and discovered documents, Henry pieced together Joey Drew's true intentions and the real purpose behind all the suffering and horror. Joey had not been trying to create living cartoon characters simply for entertainment or business purposes. His true goal was much darker and more personal, driven by ego, a desire for immortality, and a twisted vision of creation that went beyond anything reasonable. Joey saw himself as an artist on par with a god, someone who could create life and shape reality according to his vision. He believed that through the ink machine and his experiments, he could achieve a form of immortality by transferring consciousness into ink-created bodies, essentially creating vessels that would never age or die. Joey viewed the cartoon characters as templates for these vessels, beings that could be perfected and made eternal, allowing him and others to escape the limitations of human mortality. Joey's journals revealed that he had specifically called Henry back to the studio not out of nostalgia or friendship, but as part of his grand design. Henry was one of Bendy's original creators, someone whose connection to the character was fundamental, and Joey believed that this connection was necessary for his plans to succeed. Joey had engineered the entire situation, luring Henry back and trapping him in the studio's nightmare world, intending to use Henry in some way that would complete his experiments or achieve his goal of creating the perfect Bendy. Whether Joey intended to transfer his own consciousness into a Bendy creature, to use Henry as a sacrifice to empower such a transfer, or some other purpose remained unclear, but it was evident that Henry's return was the final piece of Joey's plan. This realization filled Henry with both rage and determination, understanding that he had not simply stumbled into a nightmare but had been deliberately pulled into it, that Joey had manipulated him one final time using their old relationship as bait. The discovery also revealed that Joey had been experimenting on himself with the ink, trying to achieve his transformation and immortality. Some evidence suggested that Joey had succeeded to some degree, that he had managed to transfer at least part of his consciousness into the ink world he had created. This meant that Joey might still exist in some form within the studio, that he might be watching Henry's journey, that he might even be controlling aspects of what Henry experienced. The possibility that Joey had become part of the nightmare itself, existing as a controlling presence throughout the studio, was deeply disturbing. It suggested that the entire studio had become an extension of Joey's will, a prison and laboratory where he could continue his experiments forever, unbound by physical death, but also trapped in the corrupted world he had created. The irony of Joey potentially achieving his immortality only to be trapped in a nightmare of his own making was not lost on Henry, though it provided little comfort given his own situation. Henry also learned about Joey's views on art and creation through the collected materials. Joey believed that creators owned their creations completely, that characters and worlds brought into existence belonged to their creators in a fundamental way. He saw nothing wrong with experimenting on the ink creatures because he viewed them as his property, things he had made and therefore had the right to modify, destroy, or use however he wished. This philosophy extended to his employees as well, with Joey believing that those who worked for him owed him their loyalty and lives because they were contributing to his creative vision. Joey's extreme narcissism and lack of empathy were evident in every word he wrote, showing a man who had never truly cared about anyone else, who saw other people only as tools or obstacles, who believed his own desires and ambitions justified any action no matter how harmful. Understanding Joey's psychology did not make the situation any less horrifying, but did explain how one person could create such extensive suffering without remorse or hesitation. The most disturbing aspect of Joey's true intentions was the suggestion that he had succeeded in some ways, that parts of his vision had been realized even if not in the way he originally planned. The studio had become a place where consciousness could be trapped in ink, where beings could exist indefinitely in corrupted forms, where reality was malleable and subject to will and imagination. Joey had created a world, albeit a nightmarish one, and populated it with beings, albeit twisted and suffering ones. In his own mind, Joey might have seen this as success, as proof that his theories were correct and his methods valid. The fact that this world was a place of horror and that every being in it suffered might not have mattered to Joey, who cared only about achievement and legacy rather than morality or compassion. Henry understood that he was confronting not just a madman's experiments but a madman's vision made real, a nightmare given form and permanence through will and dark knowledge. Henry's journey led him inevitably to a final confrontation with the ink demon, the twisted, bendy creature that had haunted his every step through the studio. This encounter took place in the depths of the studio, in the chamber where the ink machine's power was strongest, and where the boundary between the physical and ink worlds was thinnest. The ink demon appeared before Henry in its full horror, no longer just glimpsed in shadows or encountered briefly during chases. The creature was massive, its form constantly shifting and dripping, its smile stretched impossibly wide, its eyes empty voids that seemed to look into Henry's soul. The ink demon represented everything that had gone wrong at Joey Drew Studios, the ultimate corruption of Henry's original creation, the purest expression of the horror that had consumed the building and everyone in it. Looking at this monster, Henry felt both terror and profound sadness, seeing what had become of the character he had lovingly created so many years ago. The confrontation was not just physical but also psychological and emotional. The ink demon seemed to recognize Henry on some level, perhaps retaining fragments of Bendy's identity buried beneath the corruption, perhaps simply aware that Henry was important to its existence. The creature's attacks were relentless and brutal, using both physical strikes and manipulation of the ink environment to pursue and corner Henry. The studio itself seemed to fight alongside the ink demon, with walls closing in, floors collapsing, and ink rising to flood rooms and cut off escape routes. Henry had to fight not just the creature but the entire nightmare world it commanded, using weapons and tools he had gathered during his journey, exploiting weaknesses in the machinery and environment, and drawing on every ounce of courage and determination he possessed. The battle was exhausting and desperate, with Henry coming close to death or capture multiple times, surviving only through quick thinking and perhaps luck. During the confrontation, Henry understood that simply killing the ink demon might not be possible or might not solve the problem. The creature was made of ink and could reform as long as the ink machine continued to function and as long as the ink world existed. To truly end this nightmare, Henry would need to do more than defeat one creature. He would need to find a way to break the cycle, to destroy or disable the ink machine, to collapse the ink world that Joey had created. This realization added urgency to the battle because Henry knew that he could not spend forever fighting the ink demon, that he needed to find and accomplish his true goal while surviving the creature's attacks. The confrontation became a race against time and endurance, with Henry trying to navigate to the ink machine's core while being constantly pursued and attacked by the monstrous Bendy. Henry eventually reached the ink machine's core, a massive apparatus that served as the heart of the entire nightmare. The machine was unlike any normal device, covered with symbols and markings, glowing with strange energy, pulsing as if alive. Destroying or disabling this machine might collapse the entire ink world, potentially trapping Henry inside as it fell apart, but it was his only chance to end the cycle and prevent this nightmare from continuing forever. Henry made the decision to sabotage the machine, using tools and weapons to damage critical components, pulling levers and smashing valves to disrupt its function. The machine responded violently to this sabotage, with ink erupting from broken pipes, machinery grinding and screeching, and the entire chamber shaking as if in an earthquake. The ink demon appeared again, even more aggressive, perhaps sensing that its world was being destroyed and desperate to stop Henry from completing his task. The final moments were chaotic and terrifying, with Henry completing the sabotage while fighting off the ink demon and avoiding the collapsing environment. The machine began to fail, its power disrupted, its ability to maintain the ink world faltering. The ink demon seemed to weaken as the machine failed, its form becoming less stable, its attacks less coordinated. The entire studio began to collapse in on itself, with walls crumbling, floors falling away, and the ink draining or evaporating as if the substance could no longer maintain physical form. Henry ran for his life, trying to find a way out before the entire structure came down on top of him. The nightmare that had trapped him was falling apart, but he still needed to escape before it took him down with it. The journey that had taken him through horror and suffering was reaching its end, though whether that end would bring freedom or death remained uncertain until the final moment. As the ink machine failed and the ink world began to collapse, Henry experienced something that transcended the physical destruction around him. Reality itself seemed to ripple and break, revealing glimpses of truth that had been hidden throughout his journey. Henry understood that he had indeed been trapped in a cycle, that he had lived through this nightmare multiple times, and that each time he had failed to escape or had been reset back to the beginning. The studio was not just a physical place but a prison designed by Joey Drew, a trap that existed outside normal time and space, created through the ink machine's power and Joey's dark knowledge. Breaking the cycle required more than just destroying machinery. It required breaking free from the conceptual prison that Joey had built, rejecting the role that had been assigned to him in Joey's grand design. Henry's breakthrough came from understanding his connection to Bendy and his role as the character's creator. Joey had used this connection to trap Henry, but Henry realized that the same connection gave him power within the ink world. As Bendy's original creator, Henry had a claim to the character that superseded even Joey's, a fundamental bond that existed because Henry had drawn the first sketches and given Bendy his initial form and personality. Henry used this realization to assert control, not over the ink demon directly but over his own fate within the ink world. He rejected Joey's narrative, refused to play the role of victim or sacrifice, and instead claimed his right as creator to end what had been started. This act of will and understanding created a crack in the cycle, a possibility for escape that had not existed before because Henry had not understood what was truly trapping him. The collapse of the ink world accelerated as Henry asserted his will, with the entire construct losing coherence as its foundations were challenged. Henry saw glimpses of other versions of himself, echoes from previous cycles, all struggling and suffering through the same nightmare. He felt profound sadness for these other Henrys, understanding that they were him in fundamental ways, aspects of himself that had been trapped and recycled through Joey's design. As the cycle broke, these echoes seemed to fade or merge, as if all the iterations were being drawn back together into a single point. Henry experienced memories of things he should not remember, events from previous cycles, moments of terror and despair repeated over and over. The knowledge was overwhelming but also empowering, because understanding the trap was essential to escaping it. Joey Drew appeared to Henry in these final moments, though whether as a physical presence, a ghost, or simply a projection created by the collapsing ink world remained unclear. Joey's form was old and weak, resembling the man Henry had known but corrupted by years and dark practices. Joey spoke to Henry, offering justifications for what he had done, explaining his vision and insisting that everything had been necessary to achieve greatness. Joey showed no remorse for the suffering he had caused, only regret that his plans had not succeeded completely. He claimed that he had given Henry a gift by bringing him back, that being part of something eternal and significant was better than living an ordinary life and fading into obscurity. Joey's narcissism and delusion were complete even in these final moments, unable to recognize or admit the evil of his actions, convinced even as his world collapsed that he had been right and that history would eventually vindicate him. Henry rejected Joey's justifications completely, telling Joey that what he had created was not art but horror, not greatness but evil, not immortality but a nightmare prison. Henry refused to forgive or understand Joey, seeing him clearly as the monster he had become, someone who had destroyed countless lives in pursuit of ego and ambition. This rejection seemed to hurt Joey more than any physical attack could, as the old man had apparently expected or hoped that Henry would eventually understand and appreciate what he had tried to create. Joey's final expression was one of disappointment and confusion, unable to comprehend why Henry could not see the vision as he saw it, why his oldest colleague and the man who had helped create Bendy could not share in the dream of bringing their creation truly to life. The gulf between Joey's perspective and reality was absolute, and even in final moments, he could not cross it to recognize the truth of what he had done. As Henry moved toward escape, Joey and the collapsing ink world began to fade, with the old man dissolving into ink or simply vanishing as the construct lost its ability to maintain form. Whether this represented Joey's actual death or simply the end of his projection in the ink world remained ambiguous. Henry did not look back, focused only on moving forward, on reaching the exit that had finally become possible. The studio around him was no longer a coherent structure but a fragmenting nightmare, with pieces floating in void, with corridors leading to nothing, with rooms existing in impossible configurations. Henry navigated through this chaos using instinct and determination, following the sense of direction that his understanding and assertion of will had granted him. The journey that had seemed endless was finally approaching conclusion, with freedom tantalizingly close after so much suffering and terror. Henry emerged from the studio's nightmare, finding himself back in the physical world in a manner that defied logical explanation. One moment he was navigating through the collapsing ink world, surrounded by chaos and dissolution, and the next moment he was standing outside the studio building in daylight. The transition was abrupt and disorienting, leaving Henry unsure whether he had truly escaped, or if this was simply another layer of the nightmare. The studio building stood before him, looking abandoned and derelict just as it had when he first arrived, showing no obvious signs of the horrors contained within its walls. The street was empty, the day was quiet, and everything seemed normal in a way that felt wrong after everything Henry had experienced. He looked at his hands and body, finding them solid and real, covered in ink stains but otherwise unchanged from when he had entered the building. Henry walked away from the studio, each step feeling both liberating and uncertain. He had escaped the nightmare, broken the cycle that had trapped him, and survived horrors that should have destroyed him. Yet he carried the weight of what he had seen and learned, the knowledge of what had happened to Joey Drew Studios and to everyone who had remained there. Henry thought about his former colleagues, about Sammy and Susie and Thomas and all the others who had suffered terrible fates because of Joey's madness. He wondered if his escape had changed anything for them, if breaking the cycle had freed the consciousnesses trapped in the ink world, or if they remained imprisoned even with him gone. These questions had no easy answers, and Henry suspected he would never know for certain what had happened to those people or whether they could be saved or were beyond any help. Returning to his normal life proved difficult for Henry, as the experience had changed him fundamentally. He could not forget what he had seen, could not stop thinking about the nightmare he had lived through, could not shake the feeling that the ink world might still exist somewhere and that the horrors might not be truly ended. Henry found himself avoiding anything related to animation or cartoons, unable to look at old Bendy cartoons without remembering the ink demon and the twisted corruption of everything he had helped create. He struggled with guilt and responsibility, questioning whether he bore any blame for what had happened by creating the characters in the first place or by leaving the studio when perhaps staying might have prevented Joey's worst actions. Rationally, Henry knew that Joey's choices were Joey's responsibility alone, but emotionally he carried a burden of connection to the tragedy that would never fully fade. Henry tried to warn others about what had happened at Joey Drew Studios, but he found it difficult to make people believe his story. The events he described seemed impossible, like the ravings of someone who had suffered a mental breakdown rather than factual accounts of real events. The studio building remained standing and abandoned, and investigations found nothing unusual beyond normal decay of an old and used building. There were no ink monsters, no evidence of the ink machine, no signs of the nightmare world that had existed inside. Whether the ink world had existed in a different dimension or plane of reality that left no physical trace, or whether Henry's escape had somehow reset or erased the evidence, remained unclear. Some people who heard Henry's story suggested that he had experienced some kind of breakdown or hallucination brought on by stress or trauma. Others who knew about the studio's history of strange events and Joey Drew's eccentric behavior were more willing to consider that something unusual had happened, even if the full truth seemed too extreme to accept. The fate of Joey Drew himself remained mysterious in the physical world, just as it had been in the ink world. There were no records of Joey's death, no grave or obituary, no clear information about what had become of the man after the studio closed. Some believed that Joey had died alone and forgotten, his body never discovered, his final resting place unknown. Others suggested that Joey had disappeared deliberately, perhaps fleeing to avoid consequences of his actions, living out his remaining years in hiding under a different identity. There were even theories that Joey had somehow succeeded in achieving his twisted immortality, that some part of him remained alive in ways that transcended normal human existence. Henry believed, based on his experiences, that Joey had become part of the ink world he created, that the old man's consciousness remained trapped or embedded in that nightmare realm, perhaps still exerting influence over it even with Henry gone. The ambiguity surrounding Joey's fate meant that Henry could never be completely certain that the threat was ended, that Joey might not somehow return or reach out from whatever existence he had created for himself. The story of Joey Drew Studios became a legend in animation history, a cautionary tale about ambition, obsession, and the dangers of pursuing vision without moral constraints. Among those who studied animation history and the industry's early days, Joey Drew Studios was remembered as a place that had produced entertaining cartoons but had ultimately failed due to mismanagement and its founders' erratic behavior. The true depth of what had happened remained known only to a few, with most people aware only of the surface story of a studio that closed after financial difficulties and internal problems. The Bendy cartoons themselves achieved a kind of cult status, appreciated by animation enthusiasts and historians as examples of the era's style and craft. Ironically, Bendy became more famous and beloved after the studio's closure than he had been during its operation, with new generations discovering the old cartoons and finding charm in their simple humor and nostalgic appeal. For those who knew the deeper truth or who had worked at the studio before its final dark period, Bendy represented something more complicated than just entertainment. The character was a reminder of how something innocent could be corrupted, how creative vision could turn destructive, how the pursuit of bringing joy to audiences had twisted into the creation of suffering and horror. Former employees who survived by leaving early carried their own traumas and memories, many choosing never to speak about their experiences, wanting only to forget and move on with their lives. Some experienced nightmares and psychological problems related to their time at the studio, suffering from conditions that therapy and time could only partially heal. The studio's legacy among these survivors was one of warning, a reminder to be cautious about charismatic leaders with grand visions, to recognize when creative environments become toxic or dangerous, and to leave situations before they become inescapable traps. Henry Stein spent the rest of his life trying to process and come to terms with what he had experienced. He created some art related to his experiences, drawing and painting images that captured elements of the nightmare without being explicit enough to seem insane to viewers who did not understand the context. These works had a disturbing quality that made them memorable, and some gained recognition in art circles as powerful expressions of psychological horror and existential dread. Henry rarely explained what had inspired these pieces, offering only vague statements about exploring themes of creation and corruption, of innocence lost and monsters born from human ambition. Those who knew Henry well recognized that something profound had happened to him, that he carried a burden of knowledge and experience that set him apart from others. Henry's relationships with other animators and artists were complicated by his inability to fully share his experiences, and by his avoidance of anything too closely related to his work on Bendy. The broader lessons from Joey Drew Studios extended beyond just animation into general principles about creativity, business, and human nature. Joey's story demonstrated the dangers of unchecked ambition, of believing that artistic vision justifies any action, of treating people as resources rather than individuals deserving of respect and care. His descent from successful animator to mad experimenter showed how obsession can consume someone completely, how initial success can become a trap that demands more and more until nothing is enough. Joey's failure to recognize the evil of his actions even at the end illustrated the power of self-deception and narcissism, the ability of people to justify terrible things to themselves when their ego and sense of self-importance are sufficiently large. The studio's collapse served as a warning about the importance of ethical boundaries in creative work, about the need to maintain perspective and humanity, even when pursuing ambitious goals. The story also raised questions about the nature of creation and the relationship between creators and their creations. Joey believed that creating something gave him absolute ownership and control over it, that his characters were his property to do with as he wished. This philosophy led directly to his horrific experiments and to his treatment of employees as extensions of his will. A healthier view of creation recognizes that bringing something into existence carries responsibility rather than ownership, that creators are stewards of their creations rather than masters, that characters and stories take on lives of their own beyond their creators' original intentions. The characters that audiences loved were not really Joey's property, but belonged in some sense to everyone who enjoyed them, who found meaning in them, who carried them forward through appreciation and memory. Joey's attempt to literally possess and control his creations was doomed to fail not just technically but philosophically, representing a fundamental misunderstanding of what creation means and what relationship creators should have with their work. Despite Henry's escape and the apparent collapse of the ink world, evidence suggested that the nightmare had not truly ended. The studio building remained standing even after everything that had happened, its physical structure intact even if its interior was abandoned and deteriorating. Some people who ventured into the building reported strange experiences, feeling watched, hearing sounds that should not be there, seeing shadows moving in ways that seemed wrong. These reports were often dismissed as imagination or the natural eeriness of exploring an abandoned building, but those familiar with the studio's history recognized possible signs that something of the ink world persisted. The building developed a reputation as haunted or cursed, with local legends growing about the old animation studio and warning people to stay away. Urban explorers and thrill-seekers sometimes attempted to investigate, though most found nothing unusual and emerged with only stories of a creepy old building filled with decaying equipment and graffiti. However, some investigators reported finding ink in the building, pools and stains of the substance in quantities and locations that seemed unusual. This ink appeared fresh despite the building being abandoned for decades, suggesting that it was somehow being renewed or that it did not deteriorate normally over time. A few people reported touching this ink and experiencing disturbing sensations or visions, brief glimpses of the nightmare world that Henry had navigated. These experiences were typically short and incomplete, nothing like the full immersion that Henry had endured, but they suggested that the boundary between the normal world and the ink world remained thin in that location. Some theorized that the ink machine or some remnant of it continued to function deep in the building's lower levels, maintaining a connection to the ink world even though the main structure had collapsed. Others believed that the ink itself had become permanently infused with the dark energy of Joey's experiments, that the substance would remain corrupted and dangerous as long as any of it existed in the building. There were also reports of Bendy appearing in unlikely places, sightings of a figure resembling the character but wrong in subtle or obvious ways. Most of these reports were easily explained as people seeing normal Bendy merchandise or images and misinterpreting them due to knowing the studio's dark legend. However, some sightings were harder to explain, describing a Bendy figure that moved or behaved in ways merchandise should not, that appeared in places where no normal explanation for its presence existed. These sightings were rare and difficult to verify, with witnesses often uncertain about what they had actually seen, but they contributed to theories that something of the ink demon or the ink creatures had found ways to exist outside the studio building. Whether these theories had any basis in reality or were simply modern legends growing around a tragic story remained debatable, but the persistence of such reports suggested that the nightmare had achieved a form of cultural immortality even if it no longer posed active danger. Henry himself sometimes wondered if he had truly broken the cycle completely, or if he had simply escaped from one iteration while others continued elsewhere. In his darkest moments, he feared that other versions of himself might still be trapped in the ink world, that his escape had been personal but not total, that the nightmare continued for aspects of himself that remained behind. These fears were impossible to confirm or deny, existing in the realm of philosophical uncertainty rather than verifiable fact. Henry also worried about what might happen if someone else found the studio and activated the ink machine again, if Joey's research and designs were discovered and replicated, if the horrors could be recreated by someone equally obsessed or foolish. He tried to ensure that information about the ink machine's construction and Joey's methods remained hidden or lost, but he could never be certain that all evidence had been destroyed or that someone might not independently discover similar dark knowledge. As Henry aged, he found some peace in the passage of time and the distance it created from his experiences. The nightmares became less frequent, the memories less vivid, the emotional weight somewhat lighter. Henry focused on living his remaining years well, on creating art that brought beauty rather than horror, on maintaining relationships with people he cared about. He never forgot what had happened, but he learned to carry that knowledge without being crushed by it, to honor the victims of Joey Drew's madness by living fully and ethically. Henry recognized that his survival gave him responsibility to bear witness, to ensure that the truth was not completely lost, even if most people would never believe or understand the full story. He recorded his experiences in documents that he arranged to be preserved and possibly released after his death, hoping that someday the testimony would serve as warning and memorial for those who suffered at Joey Drew Studios. The ultimate fate of the ink world and everything it contained remained uncertain. Perhaps it truly collapsed when Henry escaped, with all the trapped consciousnesses finally released into death or whatever existence follows life. Perhaps it continued in some diminished form, a pocket of nightmare existing alongside reality, slowly fading as time passed and its connection to the physical world weakened. Perhaps it persisted fully in some dimension or plane that Henry's escape had not affected, with the horrors continuing for beings that had no hope of rescue or escape. These possibilities haunted Henry but were beyond his ability to change. He had done what he could by breaking his own cycle and escaping, by surviving to tell the story and warn others. The rest was in hands beyond his, or perhaps in no hands at all, simply the natural consequence of what Joey Drew had unleashed and what could not be fully controlled or contained once brought into existence. The story of Bendy and the ink machine is ultimately a tale of creation corrupted and ambition twisted into madness. A journey through horror that began with innocent cartoons meant to bring laughter and ended in a nightmare that consumed everyone it touched. Joey Drew started with a dream of creating something special, of making animation that would be remembered and loved, but his ego and obsession transformed that dream into something dark and evil. He pushed beyond the boundaries of what should be done, delving into areas of knowledge and practice that were forbidden for good reason, and in doing so he created suffering and horror on a scale that went beyond normal human cruelty. The ink machine was his masterpiece and his ultimate crime, a device that made the impossible real but at a cost that no sane person would consider acceptable. The creatures it produced were tragedies given form, beings that should never have existed, torn between life and death, awareness and mindlessness, forever trapped in forms that were wrong and in a world that was corrupted. Henry Stein's journey through the nightmare served as both a survival story and a moral tale, showing the consequences of unchecked ambition, while also demonstrating the power of will and determination to overcome even the most impossible circumstances. Henry entered the studio as a victim of Joey's manipulation, lured back by false pretenses and trapped in a nightmare designed specifically for him. But Henry refused to accept the role Joey had assigned, refused to be just another sacrifice or ingredient in mad experiments, and through understanding and will he found a way to break free. His escape was earned through courage and effort, through facing horrors that would have broken most people, through persistence even when success seemed impossible. Henry's survival meant that someone existed who knew the full truth of what had happened, someone who could serve as witness to the victims and warning to those who might follow similar paths. The victims of Joey Drew Studios deserve to be remembered, not as the monsters they became but as the people they were before the ink corrupted them. Sammy Lawrence was a brilliant musician whose passion for his art made him vulnerable to corruption. Susie Campbell was a talented performer whose love for her character and desperation for recognition led her into a trap that destroyed her humanity. Thomas Connor was a skilled engineer who tried to resist but found himself powerless against forces beyond his control. Boris creatures, Alice creatures, and all the others were never meant to exist, were not responsible for what they became, were victims of one man's obsession and madness. Each person who worked at the studio and suffered because of Joey's choices had their own story, their own dreams and fears, their own right to be remembered as more than just casualties of someone else's ambition. The true legacy of Joey Drew Studios should be honoring these victims and ensuring that their suffering serves as warning to prevent similar tragedies. Bendy himself, the character at the center of everything, represents the tragedy of innocence corrupted. The original Bendy was a simple cartoon character designed to make people smile, a dancing demon who was mischievous but never truly evil, a creation meant to bring joy to audiences young and old. That Bendy still exists in the old cartoons, preserved in animation cells and film reels, a reminder of what was created before everything went wrong. But Bendy also exists as the ink demon, a monster that wears the character's face while being everything the original was not, a corruption so complete that it inverts every quality that made the character appealing. This duality makes Bendy a symbol of how creation can be twisted, how something good can be transformed into something horrible, how the pursuit of bringing imagination to life can result in nightmare rather than dream. Understanding this duality is essential to understanding the full tragedy of Joey Drew Studios and what was lost when ambition consumed ethics. The question of whether the nightmare truly ended or whether it persists in some form will likely never be answered definitively. Henry escaped and broke his own cycle, achieving freedom and survival against overwhelming odds. But the ink world may continue to exist. The horrors may persist in some diminished or altered form. The boundary between reality and nightmare may remain thin at the location where Joey Drew Studios once operated. This uncertainty is part of the legacy, a reminder that some things once brought into existence cannot be fully destroyed or controlled, that consequences of terrible choices can persist beyond the lifetimes of those who made them. The story serves as warning that playing with forces beyond understanding, pursuing ambition without moral boundaries, and treating others as means rather than ends leads to outcomes that cannot be predicted or contained. Joey Drew thought he could control what he created, believed his genius and will were sufficient to master any consequence, and learned too late, if at all, that he had unleashed something beyond his ability to direct or contain. For those who encounter the story of Bendy and the ink machine, the lessons are clear and profound. Creativity is powerful and wonderful but must be pursued with responsibility and ethics. Ambition should be tempered with humanity and respect for others. Success and legacy mean nothing if achieved through suffering and evil. Creation carries responsibility to what is created and to those affected by the creative process. Leaders who demand absolute devotion and who pursue vision without accepting input or criticism are dangerous and should not be followed into darkness. These lessons apply not just to animation or art but to all human endeavors, to business and science, and any field where people seek to create something new or achieve something significant. The story of Joey Drew Studios is extreme but not unique in its basic pattern of ambition corrupting judgment and obsession destroying lives. Similar stories play out in less dramatic forms throughout history whenever people forget that means matter as much as ends, that how we achieve our goals is as important as what we achieve. In the end, Bendy and the Ink Machine stands as a cartoon nightmare that reveals deeper truths about human nature, creativity, and the dangers that lurk in unchecked ambition and obsessive pursuit of vision. The story moves from hope and creative joy through corruption and madness to horror and suffering, following a path that should never have been walked, but that provides crucial lessons for those willing to learn from it. Henry Stein's journey from creator to victim to survivor mirrors the journey of anyone who finds themselves caught in systems or situations controlled by those who have lost their moral compass. His escape and testimony ensure that the victims are not forgotten and that the warning is preserved. The ink may still flow somewhere in shadows, the nightmares may persist in forms we cannot see, but the story has been told and the truth has been revealed, and that itself is a victory against the darkness that Joey Drew tried to create and control. The dancing demon who began as innocent entertainment and became a symbol of horror serves as eternal reminder that what we create reflects who we are, and that the line between dream and nightmare is thinner than we might wish to believe, crossed not through magic or supernatural forces, but through choices made by human beings who chose ambition over ethics, vision over compassion, and legacy over the well-being of those who trusted them.